Hello, today we're going to continue our discussion on contracts. Specifically, last class we talked about offers, and today we're going to talk about acceptances because you need both an offer plus an acceptance to have an agreement, otherwise known as the meeting of the minds. So what is an acceptance? Let me give you the definition that's not on this slide. An acceptance must be on the terms of the original offer. Thus, any attempt by the offeree to materially alter the terms of the offer is treated as a counteroffer and thus terminates the offer. This can be a big problem with merchants who each use their own standardized forms, as you will see based on the mirror image rule. Under the old common law, the mirror image rule stated that there was no contract if the forms are different or if acceptance is not the quote-unquote mirror image of the offer. Thus, many merchants could not form acceptance because the forms were different and thus acceptance could not be on the same terms as the offer. And thus everything would be treated as a counteroffer. However, as we've learned, the UCC, otherwise known as the Uniform Commercial Code, has created an exception to the draconian outcomes of the mirror image rule. Under the UCC, when we are dealing with both merchants who are using their own forms, a timely expression of acceptance creates a contract, even if it includes terms that are different from those stated in the offer or states additional terms on points the offer did not address, unless acceptance is made expressly conditional on the offeror's terms of acceptance. In order to use this UCC exception, both parties must be merchants. The new terms must not materially alter the offer, and the offeror gave no notice of objections. However, the rules are treated differently if the terms are different or additional. Let's start with additional terms. Additional terms in the form may become part of the contract provided two things. First, the terms do not materially alter the agreement. And second, the offeror does not give notice of objection to the additional terms within a reasonable time after receiving the acceptance from the offeree. So for example, let's say we are dealing with Best Buy and Samsung. Samsung wants to sell 1,000 phones at Best Buy. Both are merchants. Both have different forms. On the Samsung form, it makes no mention of when payment is due. On the Best Buy form, it says that payment is not due to the vendor until 30 days after delivery. So Samsung delivers the phones to Best Buy. Best Buy accepts it, but says we are not going to pay you until 30 days after receiving them. This is an additional term proposed by the offeree, Best Buy, to the offeror, Samsung. Let's again look at the test. Additional terms may become part of the contract provided here the terms do not materially alter the agreement. In this case, the additional term of payment 30 days after receipt of the goods does not materially alter the actual contract of selling phones from Samsung to Best Buy. In addition, the offeror, in this case Samsung, so long as Samsung does not give notice of the objection to the new terms proposed by Best Buy, the offeree, within a reasonable time after receiving the acceptance, then the additional term will become part of the agreement or the meeting of the minds. It's a little bit different when we are dealing with different terms. Different terms proposed by the offeree will not become part of the contract unless accepted by the offeror. So, for instance, Samsung is offering to sell its phones to Best Buy. Best Buy says, I will buy your phones, but I don't really want your phones. Instead, I want your widgets. Here, it's different terms. And thus, the different terms will not become part of the contract unless the offeror, in this case, Samsung, agrees to those different terms. Again, in order to use the UCC, both parties have to be merchants, and they each have to have their different forms. Again, to summarize, the common law rule noted at the top part of this slide says that acceptance cannot materially vary from the offer. If it does, it's a rejection of the offer, and thus it's a counteroffer. If we look down to the bottom part of the slide, the UCC rule when forms are not exchanged is the same as the common law rule. The exception to the mirror image rule can be found in the middle, UCC Rule 2-207, for the sale of goods with an exchange of forms by merchants. Again, acceptance form can have terms that are additional or different to the offer, but remember, as I just discussed on the prior slide, the rules are different for additional terms than they are for different terms. Now let's look at different rules for accepting an offer. Let's start with a unilateral contract. Remember, in a unilateral contract, only one promise is exchanged. And remember, you don't have to say the word promise to have a promise. So, for example, if I say to Bob, Bob, if you mow my lawn, I will pay you $500. I never said the word promise once, but one promise was implicitly given by me to Bob. Thus, we have a unilateral contract. I'm the offeror, Bob is the offeree. In order for Bob to accept this unilateral offer, he has to complete the act, in this case, mowing the lawn. Bob does not have to give notice to the offeror of acceptance. Simply doing the act is enough. The rules are different when we look at a bilateral contract. Remember, with a bilateral contract, not one, but two promises are exchanged. Remember, you don't have to say the word promise to have a promise. For example, if I were to say to Bob, if you promise to mow my lawn, I will pay you $500. Notice I only said the word promise once. However, two promises were exchanged. Bob can accept a bilateral offer by saying, I accepts. Notice that notice has to be given from the offeree back to the offeror. With a unilateral contract, no notice had to be given from the offeree to the offeror. An interesting question comes up with regards to, does silence constitute acceptance? The general rule is that silence does not constitute acceptance. However, if it is in the past practices of the parties to a contract to have silence be acceptance, then silence can in fact be acceptance. So for instance, if my father-in-law, who is in the trades, goes into the hardware store like he does every day and picks up a box of nails, when he goes to the front of the store, he puts up his box of nails to the person behind the counter, doesn't say a word. The employee behind the counter takes note of that box of nails, marks it down, and nods her head. We have an offer and we have an acceptance, even though no words were spoken. Again, the general rule is that silence does not constitute acceptance. However, it can constitute acceptance if that is the past practice of the parties. Who may accept an offer? Well, the offeree obviously can accept an offer. In addition, his or her agent has the legal authority to accept an offer on behalf of his or her offeree. How do we communicate acceptance? The offeror, or the person who makes the offer, has the power to restrict acceptance. The offeror may stipulate the time, place, and or method for acceptance. For example, using the previous example that we gave, if I say to Bob, if you mow my lawn, I will pay you $500. You must accept by stating I accept by wearing a tutu in the AVC quad in the next hour. In essence, the offeror has stipulated the time, within an hour, the place, the AVC quad, and the method of acceptance by wearing a tutu. When is acceptance communicated? This is a critical question because, as you remember from last class when we talked about an offer can be revoked prior to acceptance. The offeror has the power to say that an acceptance will only be effective when it is received by the offeror. That is the smart and prudent thing for the offeror to do, because as you will see here on this slide, the general rule about acceptance is this. Acceptance is effective when dispatched, W-H-E-N, when dispatched. This is different from all the other forms of communication surrounding a contract. For instance, an offer is effective only when received by the offeree. A rejection is effective when only received by the offeror. A counteroffer is effective only when received by the offeror. Acceptance is the only one whose general rule states that acceptance is effective not when received, but instead when dispatched. So as you can see, it is important for the offeror to state in his or her offer that acceptance is effective when the offeror receives it, because if he or she fails to do that, then acceptance is effective not when received, but again, when dispatched. Other things to look at when looking at means of communication. I want to look at different types means of communication. First, let's look at authorized means of communication. So if the offeror in his or her offer specifically states that acceptance must be by mail, then the offeree must mail his or her acceptance. If the offeree mails his or her acceptance, acceptance is effective when it enters the mail stream, whether or not the piece of mail is lost or not. If the offeror uses an implicit means, then any implicit means would suffice to meet the when dispatched requirement. So for instance, if an offeror mails his or her offer to the offeree, then it is implicit that mailing it back to the offeror, the acceptance, is an implicit way of sending acceptance, and thus acceptance would be effective upon dispatch. The UCC has gone a bit further that says that any reasonable means of communication is effective when the offeror is silent upon the way that the offeree should send his or her acceptance. If the offeror states in his or her offer an authorized means for the offeree to accept the offer, and in turn the offeree does not use that authorized means of acceptance, acceptance is still effective. However, we do not use the general rule of when dispatch or upon dispatch, but rather we go back that acceptance would not be effective until it is received by the offeror. Let me give you an example. If I say to Bob, if you promise to mow my lawn, I will pay you $500. You must accept by sending me a letter within 5 days. If Bob accepts, instead of sending a letter, he sends a telegram, then acceptance is not upon when he dispatched the telegram to me, but rather when I receive it, because Bob used a non-authorized means of acceptance. Again, if the offeror stipulates an authorized means for acceptance and the offeree does not use that authorized means for acceptance, acceptance is still effective, but it is not upon dispatch, but rather when received by the offeror. Finally, I want to talk about contracts that are done online, and I want to talk about two particular types of contracts. The first one I want to talk about is a click-on agreement. With a click-on agreement, a user assents to contractual terms by clicking on a button that says yes or I agree. The other type of agreement I want to talk about is a browse wrap agreement. With a browse wrap agreement, the user does not expressly assent to the terms of the contract. Instead, agreements claim that a user assents to the terms by taking a specified action, such as using a certain website or installing software. I hope that you found this PowerPoint presentation to be useful. If you have any questions, please contact me.